Welcome to the ESDiT podcast. My name is Jeroen Hopster, and I'll be speaking today with Behnam Taebi, who is Professor of Energy and Climate Ethics at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, where he directs the Safety and Security Institute. So welcome, Behnam.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. Glad to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Today we will be discussing an article that you've published in 2020, co-authored with Jan Kwakkel and Céline Kermisch in the journal Wire's Climate Change. And the article is titled Governing Climate Risks in the Face of Normative Uncertainties. And you'll find a link to the article in the description of this episode. So let's get right into the article, starting with the notion of risk. The article starts with the observation that decisions about risk do not only have a scientific and technical, but also a normative component. Can you explain why this is the case?
Absolutely. This article builds on the discussions partially in the risk governance literature that try to include not only technological but also scientific aspects of risk and broaden up the discussion on risk on the societal and ethical issues. So basically, governing risk, dealing with risk and decision-making on risk has a lot to do with understanding with those risks, and that comes with very often probabilistic approaches, probabilities of occurrence, potential impacts, the unknowns, the unknown unknowns, and a lot of those issues that need to take into account before you could address risk and you could deal with and govern risk. What I was missing in this literature, what we were missing in this literature, was actually a stronger focus and a strong and explicit focus on the normative aspects of risk. So the ethical issues that are associated with risk and risk decision making.
Mm-hmm. And are decisions about risk invariably involve ethical decisions, or do they invariably have an ethical component?
I would argue that decision making about technological risk almost inevitably actually sort of involves some ethics component in them, and that has to do with different issues. For one thing, decision making about technological risk involves uncertainties, and uncertainties are very often, again, in the scientific and technological sense, we need to better understand risk and uncertainty associated with them. But how we deal with those uncertainties, that has an intrinsic ethical aspect to it. That, of course, the ethics of risk literature is already dealing with. But there is also sort of a divide between that literature and the risk governance literature. So this article you could see as an attempt to bridge a gap between those two literature lines.
Right, that's great. So let's focus on this notion of normative uncertainties. Can you give a broad account of what normative uncertainties are? How should we understand this notion?
Yes, normative uncertainties, as we present in this paper, are issues that have a normative component in risk decision making. And there are instances in which it is unclear which course of action is the most defensible course of action. Mm-hmm. So a decision that involves normative uncertainties is a decision that has a normative component in it. Mm-hmm. It is also a decision in which there would be different instances of, there would be different approaches possible that are all partially morally defensible. So sometimes there is a right and wrong in decision making is a clear yes and no. But in decision-making on technological risk, with all the subtleties and complexities of technological risk, very often we have to deal with an ethical component in decision-making. And the fact that there is an ethical component in the decision is, of course, something that the literature on ethics of risk that I referred to earlier is already discussing and elaborating for the last at least 10, 20 years with respect to technological risk. But what we are trying to add here is going actually one step beyond the observation that is an ethical component to it, but also focusing from a risk governance point of view on the fact that there will be different, partially defensible, partially morally defensible course of action possible. So the question is, how do we actually deal with this issue with the uncertainties, and we call that normative uncertainties associated with this decision making.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm a little bit familiar with the philosophical literature on moral uncertainty, and I think that most of this literature, as far as I know it, is tailored to individual decision making, right? And when you're talking about risk governance, your treatment of normative uncertainty, that pertains much more to uncertainty at the level of collective risk governance, right? So do you think that there's any kind of difference here between normative uncertainty as it might pertain to the individual, whereas this whereas you might be focused on this collective level of normative deliberation?
Absolutely, your observation is absolutely right. A lot of the literature on moral uncertainty has to do with individual decision making, which is absolutely also very important to focus on. But the attempt that we are doing here to sort of elevate that to the notion of collective risk, but also the risk decision making that would involve different types of risks for different people, and that add to the intricacy of the matter, because the risks that different groups of people might be exposed to is different in the magnitude, in the nature, and the decision making would not involve one single individual and an ethical dilemma that person comes across, but the decision would involve a larger group, and a decision making would be embedded within the societal complexities of technologies and how the technologies sort of function in a society. So that's a different level of intricacy as it compared to only individuals coming across what you also call moral uncertainties in terms of how to act. And of course, that has been also the focus of a lot of ethics literature. So you might say that as old as ethics in a certain sense. But this is an attempt to bring it closer to technological risk on the one hand, and sort of add to the notion of it's not only individual decision, but a collective decision with the complexities that come with the collective decisions.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so in the paper, you distinguish between different categories of normative uncertainty, right? You distinguish between evolutionary, theoretical, conceptual, and epistemic normative uncertainty. So each of these four species of uncertainty plays a role in decision-making about climate risks or climate adaptation strategies, as you argue in the paper. And I would be interested to hear a bit more about that. So perhaps can you elucidate a bit on each of these, starting with evolutionary normative uncertainty? What kind of normative uncertainty is this, and how might this kind of uncertainty play a role in making decisions about climate risks?
Absolutely. Going back to my last answer regarding actually the distinction between moral uncertainty and normative uncertainty. So I kept emphasizing that the normative uncertainty, the way we are approaching it here, is more focusing on collective risk and societal aspects of risk. So perhaps evolutionary normative uncertainty, the first category, would sort of pinpoint is the best, because then we are talking about the fact that societies will also evolve, also in terms of what they accept morally speaking. And that is something that you might refer to as evolutionary uncertainty. So because of the evolution of normativity in the society, we might also arrive at different decisions, or a decision that we have reached in the past might be considered unacceptable or less acceptable in the future. So the question is, how do we take this into account when dealing with decision-making on collective technological risk that very often spans over much larger period of time than individual decisions that we're referring to. So think about, for instance, in this case, think about the fact that something like sustainability barely existed 50 years ago. And nowadays, we all think and talk about sustainability, and it's already, you might say, an inevitable part of public policy. So this is a sort of an understanding that kept growing, still actually ongoing, because we kept talking about sustainability. We are now talking about sustainability, and also our understanding of sustainability is expanding and growing in the public policy, because, again, thinking about the same notion, we have gone from anthropocentric approaches to sustainability to biocentric or non-anthropocentric focuses. And again, that is sort of an evolution in how we accept, how we see sort of the morality progress in a society. And that is what we refer to as evolutionary normative uncertainties.
Mm-hmm. If I can follow up on that, so what is the extent of uncertainty that we are confronted with in the face of this kind of possible value change? So does that imply that we really don't know what is coming at us, and therefore we should sort of lower our confidence in current values or normative principles, or might we anticipate what these dynamics, how they might unfold in the future?
That's a very good question. I think to an extent, we need to make decisions based on where the society stands at each moment. But at the end of the day, we need to also understand that a lot of these decisions would only actually sort of be carried out, for instance, decades in the future, with implications that there might be actually different understanding of what is acceptable, normatively speaking. Let me give an example here. In the Netherlands, we've been using nuclear energy since 1960s. Early 1960s, the first commercial use. And so you might say there is about like 50, 60 years of nuclear energy production. And last year or 2 years ago, the government decided that Dutch nuclear waste needs to be on the ground by 2120. That's about 100 years in the future. So we know, I refer to 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when sustainability barely existed, or actually not even existed as a term very properly, let alone in public policy, and how much change we have gone through in the last 50, 60 years. So twice this long in the future, nuclear waste is going to be buried underground. So we need to, of course, start thinking about where to put it, how to put it, and how to protect it for the future. But at the same time, we need to also acknowledge that what we consider to be acceptable in the society now might also change and evolve. Think about the anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric approaches I was referring to. And that might require us to actually act differently regarding even the technological choices we are making for those for the nuclear waste disposal. So this is sort of an aspect, a longitudinal aspect in risk decision making that is often neglected in this sense, because we arrive at decision based on what we consider morally acceptable at this moment, and very often the term morally acceptable doesn't even come back in the decision making, but basically we arrive at decision based on what we assume or deem to be morally acceptable in a society, and that might change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So so that's evolutionary normative uncertainty. Then let's look at another type of normative uncertainty, theoretical normative uncertainty. How would you understand this notion?
If you allow me, Jeroen, I just want to skip over that one, because theoretical normative uncertainty comes the closest to what we know in ethics and moral philosophy. Mm-hmm. That is the notion that different theories would actually arrive at different decision making differently. So think about the utilitarian decision making regarding collective risk, and how a Kantian would actually look at that decision making. This is perhaps the part that has been most discussed in the literature on ethics and philosophy. But if you would be okay with you, I want to move to conceptual normative uncertainty, because that sort of ties into what I was discussing earlier. Mm-hmm. The question of which concept would actually be applicable to moral decision making, of decision making regarding risk with the normative aspect. That is also something that is that's very interesting. And again, this pinpoints the difference between moral uncertainty, individual decision making for an individual, and collective normative uncertainties, in which we have to deal with a multitude of stakeholders, people with different opinions, perhaps different values, people who would rank different values differently, and who would understand different values differently. So this is the question is, which concept, well, let's call a value a concept, moral concept here, which concept would be applicable to an actual decision-making situation? How do we understand it, and how do we balance different concepts in decision-making? And again, this is typically a situation in which we cannot arrive at an outcome in only one way. There are perhaps many different ways that are, some of them might not be morally acceptable, but many of them are actually partially morally acceptable. So then the question here again emerges: how do we deal with this issue in normative decision-making? Let me illustrate that with an example. In decision-making, in a lot of decision-making regarding future energy transition, we think about sort of applying different technological choices, and different technological choices would have different implications. Going back to the same notion of moral concept of sustainability, as I mentioned earlier, different stakeholders might actually refer to that differently. As we know, it's also a very contested notion, accepted or sort of interpreted or defined very differently in the society, and add to this the complexity of decision making regarding collective risk with many different stakeholders, with diverging, with different, but also sometimes diverging moral conceptions of what is right and what is wrong. Does sustainability primarily relate to, for instance, how we deal with ecological impact and ecological footprints in the environment, or does it more relate to continuation of or extending of the energy resources as we know? So those might actually point to the different directions. We're talking about a concept with different meanings and different stakeholders that would interpret those meanings differently. So this again adds to the intricacy that I was referring to in collective decision-making regarding technological risk.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then just briefly, a final species of normative uncertainty you distinguish is epistemic normative uncertainty. What do you mean by that?
Yes, that has everything to do actually with the state of knowledge and how we interpret the state of knowledge in the future. How we interpret, state of knowledge, and what implications we sort of assign to that. Think about, perhaps I could best explain this with an example. Think about models predicting future climate behavior. In a lot of these models, there is a lot of unknowns. And some of these unknowns we could reduce. We could try to actually sort of acquire more knowledge. And that's what we actually do with climate science. We try to make better observations. We try to interpret the data better. We try to deal with actually our unknowns, and we try sort of to better understand and potentially better forecast risks that might occur in the future. But of course, we need to also understand that there is a lot that we don't know, and there are a lot of implications, normatively speaking, about how we arrive at decision making. So not all uncertainty, epistemically speaking, regarding the state of knowledge has a normative connotation, but some do. Mm-hmm. And the decisions that have a normative connotation, epistemically speaking, those are that normativity we cannot just reduce. So in that sense, it's very different, that epistemic uncertainty in general, because as I said, a lot of unknowns we could try to remove or at least partially reduce. But when it comes to actually the normative aspects of decision making and the things that we don't know and about the implications of decision in the future, think about the population growth, think about how sea level rise might have an impact on, and think about how the flood risk would impact on different societies in different countries. So there is a lot of sort of normative implications here that we do not know. And these normative implications we cannot only reduce by acquiring more knowledge or doing more research or modeling better or simulating better. So that normativity in the epistemic sense will still remain there. And that's what the epistemic normative uncertainty tries to pinpoint.
Mm-hmm. So if these four different species of normative uncertainty that you've distinguished, do you think that there's one of them that is particularly prevalent or important in thinking about climate risks and climate decision making?
I'm inclined to think that the evolutionary normative uncertainty is perhaps the most important at this moment regarding climate risk and climate decision making. But that sort of, you can't disconnect these four categories from each other. They also tie into each other and they feed into each other, because this morality might change in the future, and how we sort of relate to the climate and climate risk and protecting different societies might change, as it has changed over the last decades also. And I think that climate is going to sort of pose unprecedented challenges to societies, challenges that we are unfamiliar with, and challenges that might push our sense of morality even further or even more, and might sort of give an extra sort of push into rethinking how we, for instance, protect different parts of the world differently. So in that sense, I'm inclined to think that between now and 20, 30 years, we might experience actually different approaches to, or we might see the progress of evolutionary normative uncertainty, or see that our understanding of climate risk and how to deal with climate risk is going to change. But as I said, these four categories feed into each other, and epistemic normative uncertainty is definitely going to play a role here too, because what we know and what we are going to actually sort of how we anticipate the future of change, that is also going to be different, and that might also have an impact on better understanding what the impact of certain risks are. Might have also an impact on how we conceive of the notion of good in the society and the rightness in the decision making. Mm-hmm. So I would be inclined to not disconnect them from each other, but rather to see them as a whole. And of course, I'm not claiming that the four categories span over every single thing of type of normative uncertainty that is around. This is just a first attempt to try to conceptualize normative uncertainties. But I'm inclined to think that the evolutionary normative uncertainty is going to be the most prevalent one.
And it's interesting to hear. And I like your point about how they feed into each other. I was thinking myself about conceptual normative uncertainty. The fact that there's this conceptual uncertainty might actually be regarded as a sort of indicator of future value change, or perhaps of evolutionary normative uncertainty, in the fact that, in the sense that perhaps if there's much discussion and much ambiguity about a certain concept, that might signal that we haven't really, as a society, yet settled on a conception that everyone agrees with and endorses, and therefore that the chances are higher that we will change or might shift with regard to this certain concept or the value that it represents.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It is indeed also value change. You mentioned that. That's a very important one, because again, this is an attempt to conceptualize normative uncertainties, and it is building on the literature. And that the evolutionary normative uncertainty is also building in the literature on value change and understanding of actually how the evolution of change of morality and how we conceive of, at least that's one of the definition of value change, as our colleague Ivo van der Poel refers to that. It's actually the progress of morality could also sort of have a value change as an implication. And I think that, as I said, the unprecedented climate risks that we are going to face the coming decades is going to push the boundaries of how we understand rightness of decision making, and perhaps how we conceive of a value such as safety. What does climate safety actually mean now and in the future? What does it mean when the next heat wave is coming our way? What does it mean whether the floods are going to exacerbate? And how do we actually conceive of climate safety exactly?
Yeah, that's fascinating. So in the final section of the paper, you present two methods that might help us in identifying and in dealing with normative uncertainties. And then the methods you identify are wide reflective equilibrium on the one hand and adaptive planning on the other. So can you briefly elaborate on these two methods and how they might help us in identifying or responding to normative uncertainties?
Absolutely. As many other applied ethicists, we were also inclined to bring in wide reflective equilibrium as a way of dealing with normative uncertainties. Of course, as an attempt, as far as I'm concerned, as an attempt to bring in or sort of shorten or bridge the gap between, on the one hand, moral theory, and on the other hand, actually stakeholders' opinions or individuals' judgments, as Rawls might call them. And in that sense, it could deal with different aspects of normative uncertainty. So the theoretical normative uncertainty, as I mentioned, that's of course in the wide reflective equilibrium. It's important to look at a normative question from different moral theories, or sort of enable a communication or conversation between the three layers, as Rawls refers to them. And that is then the sort of theoretical normative uncertainties could be very, very important. How different concepts are being conceived by different stakeholders, that also relates to conceptual normative uncertainties, and the diversity of opinions that could be around, and a diversity of sometimes even diverging opinions that makes it even more interesting to then again also connect it to the sort of theoretical normative uncertainties and to reflect on that from different moral theories. But adaptive planning, on the other hand, is actually comes from environmental management, very partially. It very much pinpoints what we refer to as evolutionary normative uncertainty. Adaptive planning enables that as a part of the system and design. You put in sort of circles of feedback, not only because things go wrong, but just as a default situation, you circle in feedback moments in your decision making. And that would enable, at least, so different methods have different purpose. Adaptive planning would enable that we would be in a position to adapt a decision, to change a decision, might the normative approach of what we consider to be right or good change in a society. So that is most above all actually a method to address evolutionary normative uncertainties, or to enable decision making to better deal with and include and incorporate evolutionary normative uncertainties in decision making. Going back to the nuclear waste disposal example, I said that in 100 years, all the waste in the Netherlands needs to be underground, needs to be buried underground in purpose-built facilities. So what adaptive planning could do here is to enable different moments of reflection in which you could sort of feed back into the actual decision and perhaps change the course and arrive at a different decision. So each of these methods could help us to deal with a part of normative uncertainties or some type of normative uncertainties. But again, I just want to emphasize that this is a first attempt, a first step that we're putting, and we very much hope that others would help us, and together we could build on different methods and ways of approaching normative uncertainties and dealing with them in actual risk decision making.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for elaborating on these intriguing ideas that you expound in the paper. I refer to the paper for listeners who are interested in more details. But in closing, I want to ask you a slightly different question that goes beyond the paper. You're affiliated to the research program Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies, which also hosts this podcast. And I was wondering, is there any socially disruptive technology in which you have a specific interest? And why would you say that we might regard this technology as being socially disruptive?
Yes, absolutely. I think I'm inclined to think that innovations in climate technologies are going to be very interesting. I particularly think about solar radiation management, solar geoengineering. Climate engineering is a better term for that, because those are methods that are being proposed for dealing with potential temperature rises that might be inevitable in the decades to come. But at the same time, these are technologies pretty much unknown yet. We know them only from simulations, but also because this is a technology that partially or actually sort of is inspired by the nature. We know that after volcanoes, there is local cooling around volcano eruptions. So that process scientists have tried to mimic, but we know very little about them. And that has also become a very controversial technology in terms of should we actually intervene in the nature on such magnitude. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that climate risk might pose us, we might be faced with, we might have to sort of face certain type of risk that we are completely unfamiliar with. Because if we don't manage to mitigate soon enough, of course, climate mitigation is going to be and has to be emphasized. It's the gold standard in climate change policy. But if you don't manage to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gases soon enough, we might arrive at a moment or the point that reducing greenhouse gases might not help anymore. So again, climate mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, climate adaptation, adapting to the society to the change that is to come, or the change that is already around us. Think about the floods that hit Europe last summer. But if you don't manage, if you don't get there, if that would not be enough sometime in the future, the next 20, 30 years, and if the temperature keeps rising, then we might be actually sort of very much in need of other types of technologies that could help, for instance, to create some kind of at least partially local cooling, because we're talking about global temperature rise, but that's an average. An average doesn't say anything about local impacts, because an average temperature rise of 1.5 could still mean that the local temperature rise in certain areas could be 5 degrees. And that is a substantial temperature rise. So average, talking in terms of average, is good for public policy point of view, but it is actually not very helpful for actual local impacts. So this is why I'm saying that I think that climate change might bring in certain types of unprecedented risks that might require us to rethink our how we perceive of or relate to certain technologies. And then these type of technologies such as solar radiation management might become relevant as technologies to consider. But then again, the question is, are these technologies that need to be considered now? Do we need to do research about them now? And if so, how do we take into account actually those normative aspects, the normative uncertainties that are associated with them? This is, by the way, also the focus of the PhD project of Ben Hofbauer, who is focusing on solar radiation management from the notion of reversibility and better understanding of the uncertainties. So my particular interest, I have a strong interest in energy and climate technologies in general. But I think conceptually speaking, solar radiation management is to be a very rich technology to consider, because it could be the technology could be very disruptive, because a lot we don't know. There could be large-scale impacts in different parts of the world than when you're starting applying this technology. But at the same time, it might be an inevitable technology that the world might want to consider sometime in the future. In that sense, I see a component of disruption in the technology, and it's on the one hand, the necessity that it might create between now and a couple of decades, and on the other hand, the strong level of disruptiveness that comes with it, which could also feed into the normative aspects of it and might push us again to get closer to evolutionary normative uncertainty, or rethinking how we conceive of normativity in the society.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a lot of food for thought and much more to discuss, but I would like to leave it here. Professor Taebi, thank you so much for coming on the episode.
Thank you for hosting.